Have you ever wondered how different the world would look right now if the Soviet Union had never fallen apart? Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, just in the real, everyday sense of how things around you might feel completely different. The collapse of the USSR wasn't just a political event. It was like someone hit a giant reset button on the entire planet. Countries broke apart, alliances shifted, and suddenly the world went from two superpowers to one. So, imagining a timeline where that collapse never happens is basically imagining a whole new version of the 21st century. And believe me, the ripple effects would touch everything from your news feed to the phone in your hand. When people think about alternate histories, they sometimes imagine it as a tiny twist, like one country winning a war or one leader surviving longer. But the Soviet Union's collapse wasn't tiny. It was a global earthquake. It changed the balance of power, the shape of economies, the speed of technology, and even the tone of global culture. So asking, what if the USSR never collapsed, isn't just a fun hypothetical, it's asking what our entire world would look like if the biggest geopolitical shift of the last 100 years had never happened. It's not an exaggeration to say your daily life, yes, yours would feel different in dozens of ways. First things first, how does the Soviet Union even survive? For the USSR to stay intact past 1991, something major has to change. In real history, the economy was cracked beyond repair, people were frustrated, and the republics inside the Union were pushing hard for independence. But let's say Soviet leaders notice the collapse coming earlier and decide to reform before everything gets out of control. Instead of opening the system too fast and triggering chaos, they take a slow, careful approach, similar to what China did. They loosen the economy just enough to avoid shortages and political explosions, but they keep the overall structure tight enough to prevent the republics from leaving. It wouldn't magically fix all problems, but it could buy them time. Enough time to avoid collapse, enough time to survive. 2. A bigger, tougher, more high-tech USSR. A surviving Soviet Union wouldn't look like the stiff, struggling version that went down in real life. It would have to modernize. It would have to compete with the West in a world that was rapidly changing. Imagine a Soviet Union that slowly opens its economy, attracts foreign technology, and tries to give its people a little more comfort to reduce pressure from inside phones. Computers and media grow more modern, but always under watchful eyes. You'd get Soviet-made smartphones, Soviet streaming platforms, and a Soviet internet that works just fine but comes with built-in censorship. The US and USSR would still be rivals, but the competition shifts from nuclear weapons to technology, industry, and who can innovate faster. It becomes Apple versus a Soviet tech giant, Silicon Valley versus Soviet research hubs. Same rivalry, new battleground. 3. NATO would not look the same at all. NATO's expansion after the Cold War reshaped Europe, but that expansion only happened because the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia became weaker. If the USSR is still alive, every country from Eastern Europe remains inside the Soviet sphere. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and especially the Baltic states stay under Moscow's shadow instead of joining Western alliances. That means NATO remains small and cautious, Europe stays split between East and West, and the old Cold War tension continues, just with updated technology and more subtle tactics. The idea of a united Europe feels distant. The West would constantly worry about provoking the Soviet giant, and the Soviet giant would constantly worry about the West gaining influence. The chessboard never gets put away. 4. The internet would feel totally different. Here's where the alternate timeline becomes personal. The internet we know today, chaotic, global, open, full of viral content, only exists because the world became more connected after the Cold War. But if the Soviet Union remains a superpower, the internet grows as a divided space, one version dominated by Western companies and another tightly controlled by the Soviet government. Firewalls, restricted access, and government-approved platforms would be the norm for anyone living under the Soviet system. And because of this divide, global online culture splits into two separate worlds. Trends wouldn't cross borders easily. Popular content in the West wouldn't automatically reach Soviet audiences, and vice versa. Even memes become political property. Imagine a world where half the planet doesn't use the same apps you do. That's the digital reality of a surviving USSR. 5. Space Race 2.0. This time, it's personal. If you love space, this alternate world might actually be more exciting. In real history, the space race lost steam after the Soviet collapse. But if the USSR stays alive, it keeps pouring energy into space exploration. The United States would feel pressured to keep up, and both sides would push harder than ever before moon missions return. New stations get built. Maybe even a race to send humans to Mars kicks off decades earlier. And with two governments fighting for prestige in space, private companies like SpaceX probably never rise to the top. Instead of billionaires launching rockets, we'd be watching government-run missions. With massive budgets and national pride on the line, space becomes a symbol of power again, and humanity gets further, faster. 6. The Middle East would be way more complicated. The Middle East is one of the regions that would feel the biggest impact from a surviving Soviet Union. In our real timeline, the USSR's collapse left a huge vacuum. The United States stepped into that space, influencing everything from politics to military actions for decades. But in this alternate timeline, that vacuum never opens. The USSR keeps supporting its allies, keeps funding local governments, and keeps challenging U.S. influence. Afghanistan doesn't follow the same path. Syria becomes even more tied to the Soviet system. Iran gains a powerful friend. Every move the U.S. considers in the region becomes risky, because upsetting the balance could trigger a dangerous rivalry between superpowers. The Middle East stays complicated, but now it's complicated under the constant pressure of two giants pulling in opposite directions. 7. Europe becomes a psychological battlefield. Europe in this timeline feels tense. Western Europe stays wealthy and modern, but it never feels fully secure. Eastern Europe stays controlled by Moscow, modernizing slower and always navigating Soviet pressure. The Berlin Wall likely remains standing, becoming a symbol not just of separation, but of a world that never truly heals from ideological divisions. Traveling across Europe would feel more like stepping through different realities. Surveillance becomes common, spies become a familiar concept, and governments on both sides stay cautious and defensive. Europe doesn't get the peaceful glow it has today. It stays anxious, alert, and divided. Every decision has political weight. Every border crossing has history behind it. 8. China plus USSR equals the power duo nobody wants to fight. One of the biggest wild cards in this alternate universe is the relationship between China and the Soviet Union. In real history, the two countries had deep tensions and even fought border battles. But if the USSR stabilizes and reforms, it might find common ground with China in their shared rivalry with the West that creates a massive alliance. Two huge nations combining their populations, resources, and political influence. Suddenly, the United States isn't facing one competitor. It's facing two powerful countries working side by side. Global politics shifts from a one versus one rivalry to something far more complicated. Smaller nations would choose alliances more carefully. Global organizations become battlegrounds of influence. Every major event becomes a balancing act between three giants instead of two. So what does the world feel like when two superpowers remain locked in long-term rivalry? It's complicated. In some ways, this world might actually be more stable because both sides know that pushing too hard could spark disaster. That tension keeps countries cautious, and big conflicts might be avoided simply out of fear of escalation. But at the same time, the constant pressure creates a background sense of unease. No one fully relaxes, no one feels entirely safe. Every crisis carries the risk of turning into something bigger. Peace and chaos exist in a strange balance, where neither side wants war, but neither side wants to look weak. The world ends up running on nerves. Before you head out, don't forget to like the video if you want more deep dives like this. And if you're not subscribed yet, go ahead and join us. We explore these mind-bending scenarios every single week. Also tell me in the comments, what's the next what-if world you want to visit?